Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Again, thank you so much for being here. My name is Craig Lemoine. I'm the incoming Director of Financial Planning at the University of Illinois. I'm very excited about this opportunity and thank you for being here with me today. We're going to spend the better part of this hour talking about the Department of Labor Fiduciary Rule. And the technical name for this is the Department of Labor Conflict of Interest Rule, but it really goes to the core of being a fiduciary and caring for your clients' funds. The target of this webcast are those folks who are in the financial service industry, maybe a broker or a financial advisor or an insurance agent or a tax professional who may be tangent to this industry, or a student who's studying to become a financial professional. So let's talk a little bit about this month in review and what we're going to get into together. This webcast, we're going to talk about the Department of Labor Conflict of Interest Rule. We're going to understand the basic elements of it. But to really understand the basic elements of it, we need the context of how did the rule happen? How did this rule come to be? And we're going to get into that context. And that context really helps us understand the need for the rule, the background of the rule, and what this rule does that's fundamentally different than other regulatory acts. After we dig into the context of the rule, we'll understand the rule itself. What is a prohibited transaction? What's a prohibited transaction exemption? Does it matter if I'm a financial advisor or if I'm an insurance agent? How am I going to be treated with regard to this rule? Is it any different? Then we'll get into the idea of the stick, the giant stick that the IRS carries to ensure that this rule takes place. We'll get into timelines and important dates. We're in a bit of a transitionary period from June 9th until the end of the year. This is what we call a transition period. And so we'll get into the transition period, then we'll get into the final period. And we'll also talk about the executive mandate to review the rule that was issued in February. How does that impact the rule? What may change by the time it goes into play? We'll end the webcast with best practices and communication. We'll get into the need for documentation and how we are in a completely different era than we were June 8th. So thank you again for being here. Just to share a little bit about myself with you, I know this is, I'm new to some of y'all. My name is Craig Lemoine. My background is I've been with the American College of Financial Services for the last 8 years. It's been a fantastic place to be. Now I'm moving to the University of Illinois. I'm extremely excited to work in y'all's financial planning program. My background is if you haven't heard y'all a few times, definitely Texan. I grew up in El Paso and have a PhD from Texas Tech University in Lubbock. This gives you a little background of me and where I'm coming from. But let's go ahead and hit the meat and potatoes that we're getting into today. So first off, how do we get here? Well, we have to understand the context of the rule before the rule makes any sense. Why did we need it? And regardless of your philosophy, if this is good for consumers, if this is bad for consumers, how did we get here? What caused this rule to come into play? And once you understand that, you're going to understand the rule a lot better. Well, really we get into this idea of fewer kids, more pressure, fewer babies, more benefits. And we'll see that in a few moments. There's a lot of regulatory models, and this has become a real national issue. So let's kick it off. How did we get here? Well, the baby boom era from 1946 to 1964 peaked about 1960. And at that point, we had about 4 million babies born a year. So you kind of think that that's the baby boom. We have more and more babies being born. And as those babies have aged through the American consumer system, what we have is a steep increase in the number of Americans who are over 65. So the result of that baby boom has turned into a bit of a demographic shift. And when we look at the estimated percentage of the US population, and you say, okay, well, what's the estimated percentage of the population of folks that are 65 or older? Well, we kind of start and we say, well, 2010 and 2020, we're looking at about 12 to 15% of that US population over 65. But what starts to happen is an extremely significant increase in the number of folks over 65 as we roll from 2020 to 2030 to 2040. And then it peaks out. But you've got about 20% of the US population over 65. And here's the thing. That number is not necessarily going to go down again. is we have what we call an aging population or a more silver population. And there's some real demographic shift that happens there. And one of these demographic shifts is there's more and more retirement assets being used, more and more retirement assets being accessed. And so to that end, the Department of Labor takes a look and goes, well, we've got more seniors over time. And this increase in seniors doesn't look back. So how did we get here? We got here with the baby boom. This whole Department of Labor rule kind of starts rolling it back to say, all right, well, we have this flux of seniors, and what do they bring with them to the table? Well, what the seniors bring with them to the table is pressure on the system. So when we have more Americans over age 65, what we have to look at are some pressure that's built in our financial model. And we have a relationship, sort of a fewer kiddos, more pressure model. And if you look in the 1950s, right around that baby boom era, you see the US fertility rates were about 3.7 births per woman. But when we look at fertility rates today, we're down to 2.1 births per woman. We estimate that that number continues to decrease, looking at about 1.7 births, and we have fewer kiddos moving forward. Couple that with longer times in retirement. So in the 1960s, retirement lasted about 12 years. Today, we're looking at about 15 years in retirement. And by 2030, we're looking at an average retirement of about 20 years. Now, this varies greatly by socioeconomic status, but average time in retirement is lengthening. Birth rates are shrinking. The number of boomers are increasing. And if you want to think of it as a juggling analogy, you've got these three balls in the air, and what winds up happening is your ratio of cover workers to beneficiaries takes an amazing dive. So if you think of the Social Security system, which is this idea of a pay-in, pay-out system that happens, in the 1960s, you had over 4 people paying in. So over 4 taxpayers paying in for every 1 beneficiary taking Medicare benefits, taking Social Security benefits on the way out. Now, if you go in the 1980s and the 2000s, 2020, and you estimate it out to 2040, we are looking at a world where fewer than 2 taxpayers are going to be paying in for every beneficiary taking money out. And this puts an extraordinary strain on our financial system. So now, instead of being in this world of having 4 people pay in for everybody taking benefits out, we're looking at less than 2 to 1. You couple that with a permanent increase in the number of seniors in the US, of folks 65 and over, longer retirements, fewer babies, more seniors because of the baby boom. And we have a situation of extraordinary pressure put on our retirement as a country. Is how do we sustain retirements that are longer when we have fewer taxpayers paying in and we have more retirees? And this sets the stage for a conflict, a pressure point. And it sets the stage for the Department of Labor going, wait a minute, we have some extraordinary problems in the road ahead we need to prepare for. So this is the pressure. This is the pressure on the system. And this pressure on the system couples with sort of an odd historical artifact of regulation, and it brings us to the Department of Labor fiduciary rule. It's fewer kiddos, more pressure on benefits. So I'm going to pause that fewer kiddo, more pressure discussion, and I'd like to move on to a little bit of the history of regulation. We had, in the late 1920s, we had the Roaring 20s, right? So the Roaring 20s come and the Roaring 20s go, and what we're left with is a Great Depression in the United States. And so to compare that Great Depression to the financial recession of 2008, in 2008, you had its peak of unemployment, based on what number you looked at, anywhere between 9 and 11% of Americans unemployed, which is a very high unemployment rate, about twice what it is today. But if you look in the Great Depression, at that unemployment rate, you're looking at 25, 26, 27, 28%. So envision 2008 and make it 2 to 3 times as bad. Now you're talking in Great Depression terms. On top of that, the 2008 recession, by 2009 and 2010, the United States started to recover and come out of it. Business started spending again. And by 2011 and 12, we were back for what has been an incredible bull run in the market. Contrast that with the Great Depression, that 1928 rolls into 29, rolls into 30, 31, 32, and just nothing is helping. Banks are failing. Americans don't have jobs. And so one of the ways that we overcame the Great Depression was a series of financial market regulations. But the financial market regulations took us all in slightly different directions. And in fact, the Department of Labor fiduciary rule is a method of reconciling what happened back in the 1930s. So in a way, this Department of Labor rule is a good 80 years in the making. And let's talk a little bit about what I mean on the next couple of slides. So how did we regulate ourselves out of the Great Depression? Well, we have these multiple regulatory models, and we'll kind of get into each one as we go in a little more depth. But some of those regulatory models are a suitability focus. But what I mean by that is there's a bit of a buyer beware embedded and infused within this regulatory policy. So the Securities Act of 33, Securities Exchange Act of 34, the McCarran-Ferguson Act of 1945, all of these acts that regulated us out of the Great Depression, or at least intended to, have a very suitability focus. In other words, if a product is suitable, you can sell it to a consumer. So if you check off suitability boxes, risk tolerance, risk profile, age, ability to continue investing, you're not necessarily looking at the best product. You're not necessarily looking at a product that meets the goals of the client. You're just saying, all right, well, are these products suitable? If yes, I can sell them. If no, I can't. So I could go down the list of attendees. There's 180 of you right now, and I could say, okay, well, of the 180 people, I've got this annuity, and it's suitable for about 80 of you. I can go sell it to the 80 with no regard for other elements. That's a suitability model. Right? The suitability model was embedded within the Securities Act of 33, Securities Exchange Act of 34, McCarran-Ferguson Act of 1945. But then we also had a fiduciary model embedded in advice. So the Investment Advisors Act, the Investment Company Act, and the Employee Income Retirement Security Act, also called ERISA. So let's get into that a little more depth. What we have are a series of regulatory trains leaving the station. It's 1933. Banks are failing. We've been failing for 4 or 5 years. You know what? We're just going to have a complete reset of our regulatory structure. So it's the 1930s. Some trains are going to leave the stations. The first trains that leave the stations are suitability trains. You're going to board these trains. We've got the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The Securities Act of 1933 is all about a company itself that's publicly traded. What are the responsibilities of that company? And the company has to be forthright, the company has to be genuine, the company has to be honest, we have to state actual risks that we face. And then we have the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Now, the Securities Exchange Act is going to regulate the actors on the market, the brokers, the dealers. It's going to create what is now FINRA, the registered reps. The markets themselves. So now we have regulation, we have a regulatory framework in 1933 and 1934, the Securities Act and the Securities Exchange Act. And these two acts have an extraordinarily suitability focus. In other words, a brokerage firm has to sell products that are suitable in nature to their clients. And registered reps of those firms have to act in kind. And these are the first two trains that leave the station. We've got the Securities Act of 33 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. So they go barreling along with the Banking Act, which really isn't the focus of today's talk. But the Banking Act, the Securities Act, the Securities Exchange Act, we're going to shore up those markets. We're going to do what we can to fix the market structure itself. Well, we didn't really catch everybody with those two acts, and so 7 years later, we're going to hit upon acts that will catch the rest of our financial world. The Investment Advisors Act of 1940. And this says, well, if you meet something called the ABC test, guess what? You're a financial advisor. And the ABC test, advice, business, and compensation. That's how I always remember that. ABC, advice, business, compensation. If you give advice, if you're in the business of giving advice, if you're paid to give the advice, guess what? You're an investment advisor, and you would fall under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. So this act has a fiduciary mindset. All right, so right off the bat, you've got trains that left the station with a suitability framework. You're getting trains that leave the station with a fiduciary framework. Now, a fiduciary framework at its very core, and we'll get into this much more in the next 20 minutes or so, but a fiduciary framework says, well, wait, it's not enough to sell a product to somebody. With a fiduciary framework, we need to ensure that we're acting in the best interest, that we're being loyal, that we're obedient, that we're acting in good faith, that we keep good records, that we're putting the client before ourselves. Now, that is a fiduciary mind frame. So in 1940, you've got these two fiduciary acts that leave the station as well. So you've already got your suitability trains. They're chugging along. Now you've got some fiduciary trains. We're going to say, okay, well, we're going to regulate investment advisors. So you meant to register under this act. And we're going to exclude people that are already on the suitability trains, by the way. Brokers don't have to register here unless they're also charging fees. We've got the Investment Company Act of 1940, and it says, well, if you're running a mutual fund, you should be a fiduciary to the folks who invest in the funds. So you do have a fiduciary duty on a board level. It manages investment companies, unit investment trusts, and these types of aggregated money and accounts. So we have these two fiduciary trains leave the station next. All right, suitability's gone, fiduciary's gone, they're chugging away. All right, so suitability, we got fiduciary, we got two more trains that are going to leave the regulatory station. We have the McCarran-Ferguson Act of 1945. So before the McCarran-Ferguson Act, there was a Supreme Court decision in the late 1930s, early 40s. It was the Southeast United States versus Southeast Insurance Company. And that Supreme Court Act found that under the Commerce Clause, the United States could indeed regulate insurance. Well, a congressional act was passed in 1945 that said, no, this isn't what we want. We want regulation of insurance to remain with the states. And I know I'm being very big picture here, but the McCarran-Ferguson Act comes out in 1945 and says, look, states can regulate their own insurance markets as long as they do it accurately. And the McCarran-Ferguson Act has the framework for states to utilize suitability standards. And so this creates an insurance industry that follows a suitability model. Now we have another train leads the station, ERISA, Employee Retirement Income Security Act. And ERISA leaves the station in the 1970s with the failure of steel companies, with the failure of Studebaker, with the failure of some big American companies. And it turns out that up through the 1970s, companies would fund their pensions with cash flow. Now, the problem with funding your pension with a cash flow is that if your company goes under, the pension stops being paid. So envision you work your entire career for a steel company, and the steel company goes bankrupt. Now you're left without a pension, you're left without income, you're left with nothing. So ERISA comes around initially focusing on pension plans, initially focusing on the duty of care of a company that offered a pension plan, and then that evolved into the defined contribution marketplace as fewer companies offered pensions and more companies went with the 401k model and the DB, the DC model. ERISA has fiduciary standards embedded within it. And so now you have trains that have left the station. In every which way, these trains are gone. You've got the suitability trains, you've got fiduciary trains, you've got McCarran-Ferguson, you've got ERISA. And what you wound up doing was creating a regulatory environment where the person giving advice to a retiree, are they a suitability duty? Are they fiduciary duty? Does it matter? Are they a broker? Are they an insurance agent? Are they a financial advisor? And it turns out a consumer has no clue who's giving them the financial advice. And so we wound up and we wound up in a situation where we said, this could become problematic. And to give you a scope of the problematic that this could become, in 2012, we had about $23.7 trillion of retirement assets. And this number is just going to get larger as we have more retirees and we have more of a bull market. About 24% of that were in IRAs, about 17% were in 401ks. And we'll see those numbers increase as, again, fewer and fewer Americans have access to pensions and more Americans have access to these IRA and 401k and profit sharing style plans. Now, the concern the Department of Labor has is sort of threefold. The first concern is, all right, well, we think we are making an assumption that there's about an excess of $17 billion a year in costs from high cost or unscrupulous or regulatory concern or conflict or confusion. And so we think that that's costing Americans about $17 billion a year. And to give you an idea, that's the amount spent by NASA in any calendar year. The entire space program could be funded, in theory, with the Department of Labor's assumption of excess cost. Now, it's not just cost fueling this, though, it's also pressure. It's taking a look at our current benefit systems and saying, man, you've only got about 2 people paying in for every beneficiary taking out. That's not sustainable. Maybe Medicare is not sustainable. Social Security can sustainable. The one thing we can do is to simplify a regulatory model on retirement assets. And when you take into consideration all of those things we've talked about, pressure, changing demographics, excess costs, regulatory confusion, you wind up with a national issue. And how you want to treat this national issue does vary to some extent politically. It varies to some extent by what model you were compensated on before this happened. But there is a national issue here when we talk about retirees. And so we have the budget of NASA, the assumption made by the Department of Labor that we could have a space program, 2 of them actually, if we curtailed some of the costs of retirement advice. So what do? Well, we have a Stephen Colbert-style eagle, and it barks at us that it's time to create a rule. And so the Department of Labor launches a conflict of interest rule. We call that the fiduciary rule. And what it says is, forget this nonsense. Forget all these trains that have left the station. That's immaterial. What we're going to do instead is put everybody under a great fiduciary umbrella. And by having everybody under this great fiduciary umbrella, we can eliminate conflicted compensation, and then we can allow conflicted compensation again, but with our rules. And we're going to mandate how you have to treat people. All right, so it sounds really fantastic in principle. And to be clear, we'll get into timing a bit later, but I want to be very clear that this is the law. This is the rule. This went into effect June 9th. So at this point in the game, I'm not talking hypothetically anymore. Right? This is actually what you're charged with doing. Now, there's certain pieces of the rule that aren't finalized yet, and it'll become finalized at the end of the year. But for the most part, this is live. This is something we all need to be doing. So what did the rule do? Well, the rule says, number 1, if you are giving advice or transactions, and we'll get into the exact type of advice in a little bit. It doesn't matter if you're a registered rep of a broker-dealer. It doesn't matter if you're an insurance agent. It doesn't matter if you're an investment advisor. If you're working in the retirement space, you are now fall under a great fiduciary umbrella. So what we're doing is we're taking all those regulatory trains that we started off with, and we're having them come back into the station. We're having them make their way back into the fiduciary umbrella. I don't really care if you were in a suitability model before. Now you're not. So now we have one umbrella for everyone. And there's pros and cons to that from a marketing standpoint. There's pros and cons to that from a consumer faith standpoint. But I'm bringing you all into your great fiduciary umbrella. And as a fiduciary, what do I mean? Well, as a fiduciary, there's certain acts that you need to take as being an informed agent of a principal. And you need to treat your client with your client's best interest before your own. And you accomplish that task with the following duties. Now, there's no set check the boxes when we talk about a fiduciary duty, right? It's not like suitability where I can legitimately look up a FINRA standard and check boxes off and be done. With a fiduciary standard, you have principles, you have concepts. You have the principle of an agent-principal relationship where I'm your agent and I need to act in your best interest. And generally speaking, that means that I have to have a duty of care. And I have to put your interests before my own. I need to make sure that your goals are met before my goals, which are generally somewhat of a compensation element, come into play. I have a duty of loyalty and obedience to you. So I need to be loyal to your wishes. I need to ensure the type of retirement you're looking for. When we allocate portfolios, when we set up income strategies, that loyalty and obedience is fundamental that I'm meeting your needs as a consumer. We have a duty of good faith, that I have to have some reasonable standing to believe that the assets and strategies that I put you in will be meeting your goals in the future. Now, I have the duty to report fiduciary breach, and this is a big one. This is a big one that firms fought very hard against. A duty to report fiduciary breach would mean that if I'm working on a client and I see what another financial professional's done to that client, it's my job to inform the client that a fiduciary breach may have occurred. If I'm at a call center and I work for a large wirehouse, my client calls me and says, hey, I need to do XYZ with my account. If a fiduciary breach has occurred, I now have a duty to report that breach. And as a call center employee, this gets a little tricky, right? Because where do I fall on the totem pole in my firm? I have the duty of record keeping as well. Yeah, the duty of record keeping. So all of us are now, any financial planner giving advice in the retirement space, now fall under a fiduciary umbrella. These are the duties that we must perform in order to work in the retirement space. And it doesn't matter if you're selling products or giving advice, any way about it, you're going to find yourself under this umbrella. And so this rule brings all the trains back to one station, puts everybody under one fiduciary umbrella. This is the core of the Department of Labor Conflict of Interest rule. This went into play June 9th. All right, so that's the core of the rule. So what is covered? What is in the umbrella, right? What type of elements do you do? Well, if you give advice acquiring, holding, disposing, or exchanging investments, okay, so that's new. That's different. That's a very broad umbrella. If you provide recommendations of distributions or rollovers to participants and IRA owners, that activity is specifically and explicitly covered. So now we have an entire additional element in play, and we'll cover that on the next slide. Recommendations to fiduciary advisors and also recommendations of type of investment accounts. Right? So all of these activities are by statute covered under the fiduciary umbrella. So it's very easy to find yourself giving advice to a retiree today and be a fiduciary. It's very easy to be giving advice to a retiree and some tangent elements too. What's new about the rule is that it covers IRA owners. In the past, ERISA had regulation for qualified plan participants, so those with profit sharing plans or defined benefit plans, but not IRA owners. This extends the coverage into the IRA space. So now that that coverage is extended in the IRA space, the level of fiduciary umbrella is expanded greatly into a new area. Also, activities that would be held to a fiduciary standard are much broader than they were before June 9th. So now we're going to say, did you buy a stock? Did you sell a stock? Did you exchange a stock? And then any recommendations you would give, let's say a plan administrator, and then the type of investment account. So let's get a little more specific as far as what activities are covered under the new rule. Let's say that you're an insurance agent and you recommend an income annuity and an IRA account. Well, you now have to meet the fiduciary standard. So it's not enough that that income annuity is suitability a good fit for the consumer or the client. Now we need to ensure that the income annuity would meet the fiduciary duty imposed on that client. So is this in the client's good faith? Is it loyal to the client? Does it meet their objective? Is it prudent to sell? And the insurance agent has to recommend that within the IRA account. And so that's going to be a little different than in the past, where this would be held under a suitability standard. Now, this activity would be in a fiduciary standard. Well, let's say that a broker recommends. They go, well, you've got this IRA, and it's with a really big brokerage firm. You should move it over to mine. We charge fees, and fees are better than commissions, and so you should move it in my fee-based account. Well, that action of recommending a type of compensation is a fiduciary action and would subject you to the terms of the new fiduciary rule. Oh, this one is really tricky, the third down. And I think companies like Morningstar have a huge opportunity to make some loot on this one. What about an old employer retirement plan into an IRA? All right, well, this hits me right down the middle. So I have a 403B at the American College. What options do I have? Well, I could roll it into a 403B at the University of Illinois. I could roll it into an IRA. Heck, I could leave it at the American College. What am I going to do? Well, advice in this area is held at a fiduciary standard. And what that means to an advisor is to be very careful in this space. Because can you be prudent? Can you give loyal and prudent advice to move an account from one institution to another if you don't have a near expert understanding in these areas? So what is the justification for moving the old retirement plan into an IRA? Is there some advantage to that? Did we document it? Are we acting as a fiduciary? Am I being loyal? Am I acting in good faith? This makes the entire financial planning world much, much trickier, because up until June of this year, there was an awful lot of IRA distribution. Someone would retire. We have this idea of however many thousand Americans retiring a day. But now it's not enough to say my IRA is great. My account is wonderful. You should move your assets into my firm. That's not nearly enough anymore. Now the standard is, let's evaluate the old plan, let's evaluate the new plan, and let's evaluate the IRA, and let's make a fiduciary decision what's in the best interest of the client. This changes the game dramatically. And in the last month, we've seen a lot of change. The last element of specific examples of where this Department of Labor rule is impactful is, all right, well, one strategy that's often used when we work in the retiree marketplace is long-term care insurance. We say, oh, long-term care insurance can be critical. We have, a family with assets of 250,000 up to about 5 million. We say, well, that's a really sweet market for long-term care, and long-term care can really help protect the consumer. Well, let's say that I have minimum required distributions out of an IRA account, and I want to use those minimum required distributions to buy insurance. Would that subject me to the rule? The answer is yes, specifically addressed by the Department of Labor in an FAQ, that if you take distributions out of an account and you then buy an insurance product, you are making a recommendation to purchase insurance. So the depth of this rule is really hard to overestimate. That recommendations of distributions, acquiring, holding, disposing property, fiduciary advisors, investment accounts, and one last note before we hit the next stage here. Let's say that you are a realtor and you're selling a house, and the retiree comes to you. The retiree says, hey, I'm going to get the down payment out of my Roth IRA. I'm going to take a distribution out of my Roth. I'm over 59 and a half, so there's no tax there. And take a distribution. I'm going to use that distribution to buy a house. And you say, oh, that's a great way to have a down payment. Well, let's think this through. Now, a realtor has, to some extent, made a recommendation on a distribution. Are they covered by the rule? Would their transaction now be covered by the rule? I think there's those that would say maybe. So the reach of the rule could potentially go beyond your general set of insurance agents, financial advisors, and brokers. The reach of this rule could be much broader than we think it is today. And we'll have some litigation to determine how broad it is. But I would be very careful in the real estate space, even in the car purchase space on this end. I would be very careful in that. All right, so what does the rule do? Well, the rule says, number one, you're a fiduciary. If you give any of the advice of the prior slide, you're a fiduciary. As well, not only are you a fiduciary, but now I'm going to eliminate your ability to self-deal. So we're going to eliminate self-dealing. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to prohibit any compensation model whereby a financial professional would be conflicted. So I'm going to take away the opportunity for you to act not as a fiduciary by starting to mess around with compensation structure. Well, the Department of Labor rule says no more commission sales. It's out, right? So if you're getting a commission on an IRA sale, can't do that anymore. Well, what about a traditional asset under management model, right? Where you charge 1% of assets managed. Oh, that's out too. Department of Labor rule is going to clear the plate. They're just going to take their arm, they're going to wipe off that table, knock everything to the floor. No. Because with an AUM model, you're inherently biased towards rolling assets from employer plans into IRAs. Right? You wouldn't get paid on my 403B if we had a fee-based arrangement, so that wouldn't work. Well, performance fee models are also out from that same end, that they would encourage me to have a compensation model where I could potentially be conflicted. So this rule eliminates conflicted compensation. Now it's going to allow it back in under certain auspices, but we're eliminating conflicted compensation. So you work in the retirement space, you're a fiduciary to your client. Here, I'll make it easier for you. I'm going to eliminate your ability to get paid in a way that might create a conflict. Now, there are some compensation models that may not be prohibited, and those typically are net worth compensation models. Some work by Michael Kitces in that space as well. These net worth models really do fly quite over the radar with this one. The net worth compensation model would say, well, it doesn't matter what assets you hold with me, I'm just going to charge you on your total net worth. That would not be conflicted, right? Because there's no incentive for me to move your assets into my firm. I'm charging you based on the value of your house, your retirement plans, and your IRAs and your personal property. Well, if I'm doing that, then I may actually wind up not having a conflicted compensation. The other element is some sort of subscription model. So if you have some kind of base subscription model where the client pays you $1,000 a quarter, $2,000 a quarter, that flat fee model may also not be prohibited. But our traditional ways of getting paid in this business, commissions, AUM fees, performance fees, were just completely knocked off the table. Can't do those anymore unless you follow specific rules. So what is the big stick? Right? What's the worry? Why would a consumer care? Why would a financial advisor care? Well, the giant stick is that if you engage in a prohibited transaction, which the Department of Labor just pretty broadly outlined here, as these are now prohibited transactions with these prohibited models, here's the problem. Taken from the IRS, generally if an IRA owner or his or her beneficiaries engage in prohibited transactions, the effect is the account being treated as distributing all its assets to the owner at fair market values the first day of the year. In other words, the big risk, the big fear here, the giant stick that we have to make sure that this goes into play is that envision a world where you don't act as a fiduciary correctly in an IRA, you make some prohibited transactions, and the next year, that entire IRA becomes non-qualified. You have a giant tax, you might have a giant penalty on top of it, and they're going to go to the financial advisor. It's going to become to some extent, could be a very litigious mess. So keep in mind that this is sort of the back end stick of the Department of Labor rule. And it's like, yeah, you better follow the rules. We better act appropriately, or we could get ourselves in a little trouble. So let's then create a world we can work in. So the Department of Labor rule, what does it do? It says we're a fiduciary. Then it says I'm going to eliminate your ability to receive conflicted compensation. And now I'm going to allow certain types of conflicted compensation back in, but I'm going to have rules around them. The first is that you can go to the Department of Labor on an individual basis and you can apply for an individual prohibited transaction exemption. So you can say, I understand that this technique would normally be prohibited, but you should exempt it, and here's why, and here's protections to the consumer. And they can issue on an individual basis, they can issue you an exemption. So if you have this great strategy with an income fund, you can go to the Department of Labor and you can have them write an opinion for you, and you might get one, you might not. But what's much easier for this industry to use are class-wide prohibited transaction exemptions. So there's three I want to talk about today. There's three that impact us more than the others. The first is called a flat fee class-wide PTE, and that would be a flat percentage of assets charged. We'll say 1% AUM fee. So if you want to charge 1% of assets under management, you can utilize the flat fee PTE, where you're going to have to notify the Department of Labor that your firm is going to be acting under the flat fee PTE. You acknowledge that you're a fiduciary, which you probably were anyway if you're an investment advisor. And your world is relatively unchanged than it was before. Now, the worlds that changed more, we have something called 8424, which is a class-wide prohibited transaction exemption. This is for fixed products, generally speaking, fixed annuity products, where you have a fixed percentage rate of return, a deferred fixed or SPIA, single premium immediate annuity. And to qualify for 8424, you have to acknowledge that you're a fiduciary with your client. You have to meet some elements of behavior, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. And the biggest one is called the best interest contract exemption, or BICE. This is the largest class-wide prohibited transaction exemptions. And in this case, you're going to need a written contract between a financial institution and a consumer. You need to acknowledge that you're a fiduciary in writing. And unfortunately, the details are still a little tentative in going through revision with the SEC and also with an executive review that was had in February. But what we've done now with the rule is a bit of genius. We've said you can't get paid like you were unless you follow our specific mandates. So you can follow a fee mandate, you can follow an 8424 mandate, you can follow a best interest contract exemption mandate. And so that's the ways that you can still act, the ways that you can still be compensated under the new rule. Now, the genius of the rule and what is live today, what every of the PTEs I just talked about. So if you're working in the retirement space today, here's the genius of the rule. The genius of the rule are that impartial conduct standards must be followed starting June 9th. So what does that mean? Well, an impartial conduct standard means that a financial institution, such as a brokerage firm or such as an insurance company or a registered investment advisor, must have a culture and training to promote impartial conduct standards. And those standards would be, number one, that you must provide advice in the retiree's best interest. So we need to train to provide advice in their best interest. You must charge reasonable compensation. So reasonable compensation does not necessarily mean cheapest. However, we are going to see in a few slides that this may be the death of the idea of an A share, a loaded share in the mutual fund industry. You also have to avoid misleading statements with consumers. Let's hope there weren't too many of those beforehand. But now we need, on a cultural level, these impartial conduct standards must take place. These are live. As of June 9th, these became the law of the land. So anyone working in the retirement space, any company, any financial institution needs to ensure that they've created a culture of advice, reasonable compensation, misleading statements. This fundamentally changes recruiting, and it fundamentally changes rewarding. If I go recruiting new financial advisors, in the past, I might find financial advisors with high production. I may find financial advisors that had large assets they brought on, and I could incentivize them to come to me. So pulling companies out of a hat, if I'm brokerage company A, I can look at brokerage company B and I can find their biggest producer and I can say, hey, come on over to A, we're better. And I'm gonna give you $500,000. But there's an implied element that you're gonna sell all your clients' current mutual funds and buy mine, right? Now that changes recruiting dramatically because we can still go after a high-performing individual, but we can't have the expectation that they're gonna sell all the client assets out and buy new ones. Because what if that's not in the best interest of the retiree? It also goes to rewarding. You know, we used to do a lot of incentive trips in this business. And while the SEC cracked down on some, there's still an awful lot of trips to Hawaii and Miami and beautiful places in Banff, you know, and how we reward is a culture that rewards the sale of a specific product meeting the impartial conduct standards. And I would say it's probably not. So we need to change the way we reward on an institutional level and change the way we recruit. And that happened in June. So look out for those changes. That's big. And the way we recruit and reward has changed in this business. And that's something we're going to see more and more of as the impartial conduct standards become more defined. So let's talk a little bit about timelines. June 9th became the transition period, and then we have a blurry final date. And we'll get into why that's blurry here in a moment. But the transition period is here, right? June 9th was a transition period. Number one, fiduciary advice is on the table. So any advice you give a retiree, any advice you give on an IRA, on a profit sharing plan, on a defined benefit plan, that advice is now fiduciary advice. Financial institutions must follow impartial conduct standards. So we need to fundamentally rethink how we train We need to fundamentally rethink how we compensate, how we pay for products. All of that needs to change. There are also specific exclusions to the rule. First off, we have something called a 50-50 rule. If I give advice to a retirement plan with at least 50 participants and $50 million of assets, that advice is excluded from the fiduciary rule. Right? So I can go sell away to as many large retirement plans as I want. The incentive there, the protection there is that somewhere in that retirement plan structure, there is a fiduciary, and so we can have an exemption for selling to that plan. There are also clear definitions of education. So part of the rule said, wait a minute, what if you have a software program that determines an asset allocation for a client? Is that a fiduciary? Are you making a fiduciary recommendation? So the Department of Labor was very clear as to what's education and what's a recommendation. A recommendation is a call to action. That's what they left it. So a call to action would be a recommendation. I'm calling you to act. Education would be a non-call to action. So providing you with a risk tolerance model would be education. Having a built-in retirement calculator in your 401k dashboard, that would be education. It's only a call to action that is a recommendation. So there's clear exemptions and examples of education. Retirement asset allocations were specifically exempted. It's very important that consumers have access to say, well, what portfolio should I be in the world of 401ks and 403bs? And so we exempted that. What is happening during the transition period is the Department of Labor is in discussions with the Securities Exchange Commission, who was relatively quiet during the rules forming over the last 3 or 4 years. So we're discussing with the SEC. Because the SEC is the regulator of brokers, it's the regulator of investment advisors, although it does it under 2 different regulatory platforms. So we're discussing with the SEC during the transition period. Well, let's hit the finality of the rule. So right now, all a firm really has to be doing is moving towards their PTEs. But starting January 1st, those prohibited transaction exemptions will be the law of the land. And from that end, the best interest contract exemption, or the BICE contract, is going to be the law of the land, and saying, look, you're a fiduciary. It's going to limit arbitration, which companies are still very upset about. And the definition of fiduciary is going to be signed. So the client's going to get a letter and say, look, we're a fiduciary now, and here's what that means to you. So starting January 1st, there's really kind of a blurry line in the sand. Now, January 1st is coming really quick. So that line in the sand may be here. And in fact, just to go back one slide, the transition period caught a lot of us off guard. I've been following the rule for 2 years now, and I've written on the rule and spoken on the rule. And it did catch me off guard because February, the current administration issued an executive order to review the rule in depth, and then there was a 60-day freeze, and I think everyone kind of thought it would go away. And the fact that the Department of Labor went ahead with it was fairly surprising. So from that end, I wouldn't count on the rule going away. One of my very dear friends at the American College, he gives the example, Jamie Hopkins, that the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's going to be really hard to put back in. I think he's right on that end. So this blurry line in the sand, well, come January 1st, 2018 is the tentative date that these class-wide PTs go into effect. That the Department of Labor is currently talking with stakeholders during the period, and we also have a large financial reform act in the wing called the Choice Act. Right? The Choice Act, the idea there is creating hope and opportunity for investors, consumers, and entrepreneurs. So that's the Choice Act. The Choice Act is a very, very large financial reform act. It very well may have elements of reform with Dodd-Frank. It could change the way the SEC works to some extent. The Choice Act could be a huge financial overhaul, and based if the GOP has votes to get this done, it could change the entire Department of Labor fiduciary rule too. So the Choice Act is coming. I would encourage you to read up a little bit on the Choice Act. It's going to be very wide sweeping in the financial service market. So I would really look at that. Also, there is an executive review, and the Department of Labor says, look, it's the law of the land now, but we're going to continue based on that executive review to consider this rule, to look at all the stakeholders involved in the rule, and determine the final implementation of that rule. So the rest of the time I want to spend today on some best practices. One of the best practices is documentation. If you're working in the space, and if you're going to use the fee-based PTO, if you're going to use 8424 as your PTO, if you're going to use BICE as your PTE on that, you need to document. How am I showing that I'm loyal? How am I showing I'm acting in good faith? How am I showing that I'm acting in the best interest of the client? How am I know the client's goals? We need to document, document, document. Documentation has never been more important in financial services as it is today. So best practice, we need to document the goals. We need to document when we talk to the client. We need to document when we make recommendations. If you're going back to my example of my own 403B, if you advise me to roll that in an IRA, you need to document why. Why was the current 403B not meeting his needs? Why would an IRA meet the needs better? And when you have costs built into the model, documentation becomes that much more important. That once I start charging more fees than you were paying, now you really got to start justifying your actions in a retirement model. So documentation has never been as important as it is now. We also have T-shares, and the Department of Labor acknowledges that T-shares have taken longer to put into place than they initially thought, and they're likely to give a little breath and space on T-shares. But a T-share is a lower cost version, a transaction share, that's what the T stands for, T-shares. It's a lower cost version of current active managed brokerage shares. So if you're a believer in active investment, that is that you have a fund manager and she chooses investments and you're going to beat the market that way. Currently, the way to get into that, we have A shares, B shares, and C shares, and we're going to see those roll out and this new T share with a lower front-end cost come into play over time. So look out for T shares. Those are being developed today. And there are some models that say, forget about it. Let's have what we call a clean share. So a clean share is a share of an investment company fund, a share of a mutual fund that's going to be clean. In other words, it doesn't pay any kind of 12B1 fee. It doesn't pay any kind of brokerage fee. It's not going to pay any little something marketing fees. A clean share is exactly that. So you can choose to use it in your platform, but it's not going to give your platform anything on the back end. However, from a consumer perspective, a clean share may be the way to go. Because if I'm trying to act in a way that's in your best interest, a clean share doesn't have any kickbacks. It doesn't have any type of additional compensation paid out, and so a clean share may be the way to go. Now, say goodbye to Vegas. This is a very important element, and I'm going to share a little story here. So I was talking to a company doing a lecture on the Department of Labor rule, and we were in Miami, and there was a shrimp cocktail reception, and I was talking right before the shrimp cocktail reception. So they're putting out the cocktail shrimp, and they're putting out the drinks in the bar. And I'm sitting there, I'm talking a little bit about the best interest contract exemptions and how we need to act and treat clients. And I realized this is the end. The enjoy the cocktail shrimp while they're here, because that's going to be it. If my financial institution is charged with setting up an environment that rewards behaving well in the client interest, one of the problems that we get into is reward trips in the financial service industry. Is a reward trip necessarily in the best interest of a consumer? And we might be rethinking how all that happens moving forward. Also, this rule is a bit of a very genius written rule because there's no workaround. In other words, it's very clear. And if you work in an IRA space, if you give any type of advice or transaction, you're under the same umbrella. So no longer are we going to have a financial advisor operate differently than a broker, operate differently than an insurance agent. Now everyone is under the same umbrella. So now we're all working in the best interest of the client. So from that end, there's no easy out here. And you are either a fiduciary in the IRA space or you're not going to work in the IRA space. The other two elements I really want to hit on are considering home equity. When you look at income, home equity, to some extent, home equity lines of credit, reverse mortgages, this has been something the industry has been very lukewarm on getting into. After the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of firms said, don't even use the word reverse mortgage. The home equity is somehow sacred. But the reality is that quite often home equity can be a fantastic source of retirement income. And when you contrast it to other models, that is buying, annuitizing, or perhaps using an income stream out of an IRA, a reverse mortgage can be very beneficial for a consumer. So if you're giving advice as a fiduciary and you don't consider home equity, I would challenge that perhaps that fiduciary advice may not be whole. So consider home equity in the retirement space. If we need an income stream, that may be somewhere to go. Lastly, reasonable cost. Reasonable cost is a little bit nebulous, right? We need reasonable cost to consumers. What is a reasonable cost? Well, the industry and the market will set a reasonable cost over time. No question about that. You see T-shares as a move towards reasonable costs, getting away from a 5% load, getting into more of a 2% load, and clean shares may not even have any of that. So reasonable cost will play out, but do keep an eye on that. What is a reasonable cost to a consumer? And if you're moving from a very cheap retirement plan into a very expensive IRA, you may take a look at that in a deep breath and decide, is this really where we're headed? So this webcast was brought to you. We actually have a sponsor today, Lone Star Financial Education, a CFP exam review company. And go check them out. New player in town, but fantastic reviews. And I know one or two of you here have taken them. And so, give it a shot. It's an alternative, but a really good one at that. And if you have any questions for me as we wrap up the hour, you can ask now and I'll do my best to answer them. Or you can send me an email at higheredcraig@gmail.com. I'm still getting my Illinois webcast set up from that end and from that element. So I have a question and I'll do my best to answer it. We have a couple of minutes left. If you have any other questions, you can also type them in the webcast box. So does it apply to CPAs who do not hold securities licenses? It would apply to any CPA who's making recommendations in the retirement space, right? In that case, if you're working with a client and you make a recommendation on a rollover, well, it doesn't necessarily matter if you're getting paid a commission or if you're getting paid an AUM fee. If you're billing by the hour and you wind up making a rollover recommendation, I would contend that this rule does probably apply to you. And you probably would be a fiduciary in these areas. Okay, so that's one question. Okay, if I give tax advice in the distribution as a CPA, a fiduciary, well, tax advice may not follow as well under. Let me go back here. So tax advice isn't specifically called out when we get into the activities, right? So acquiring, holding, disposing, or exchanging. So from that end, we're not necessarily giving tax advice, but again, if you give advice on what to do after the taxes are paid, or you give advice on moving from account A to account B, now you are getting into a situation. So if we're just calculating the taxes, we shouldn't have a problem. But on the other hand, if you say, okay, we'll take the rollover, put it in an IRA, now you might be making an investment account recommendation and you might find yourself falling under the umbrella. Right? That's not too far a stretch. Thank you, John and Barbara, for those questions. So are there any prototype agreements available for BICE or other PTEs? That's a great question. Thank you. There are some prototype agreements. They're not publicly shared yet, but I have been on a few phone calls where you definitely have some of the larger mutuals working with one another with prototype agreements. I wouldn't be shocked if the brokerage houses are doing the same thing. I think you'll have more variety in the RIA space, whereas I think you'll have some big standardization in the mutual insurance space. The mutuals, I think, will come together on this and come out with some prototype language, whereas RIAs looking at the fee-based model might have some uniqueness. Also, I wouldn't be shocked if you wind up seeing more and more alternative models, assuming that this thing holds, and I wouldn't make any other assumption considering. I really think you're going to be seeing a little bit more of the net worth and flat fee model. Those might catch on. Instead of charging 1% for assets under management, what if I charge you 0.25% for your entire net worth? Right now, I don't fall under the rule, and at the same time, I can provide a unique form of advice. So I really think we'll see more of that as we move forward. Okay. All right. Another question. Can I discuss risk models? So with the IRA risk models, I think what you're looking for there, Justin, is a take of different assessments and some matching risk tolerance to consumer goals. From that end, there is going to be a bit of leeway. The duty of care, obedience, good faith, report, and record keeping doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be in the same asset allocation across firms, right? And that very well could be one of the advantages to using an IRA instead of a qualified plan. You could approach me and say, hey, Craig, your 403B has stocks and bonds. My IRA is going to have a REIT position. It's going to have some alternative investment positions. It's allowed in IRAs. And so perhaps more asset allocation could lead towards more models. So from that end, I think you're seeing a bit of a hesitancy as the industry moves into this. I think you're going to see over time the expansion of options. But at first, I think there are some big questions about what to do and what's next. And okay, well, what's reasonable compensation? That's a fear. You don't want to be the one charging 100 basis points and then you get dinged. So if you recommend financial advisors, are you a fiduciary? If you recommend a financial advisor to a client and they go and they make all these decisions, then you wouldn't necessarily fall under the rule, right? I'm not an attorney, but you wouldn't. On the other hand, if you said, okay, well, this is the type of account you need, and here's where you can get it, now I'd be a little more careful. So if you go out and say, okay, well, here's the type of account, you should be in a fee-based account, you just told someone to roll their money in a fee account, right? So at that point, you now might have fallen under the rule. Whereas if you just say, here's some financial advisors in town, they're University of Illinois grads and they are fantastic, that case we would be acceptable. But I want to thank you all so much for coming. I really hope you enjoyed today. We're going to have this recording up, and so you'll be able to go back and listen. And I hope that you participate in future webcasts we put on as a department. And I know when I get engaged in August, can't wait to work with all of you. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. And we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks so much for coming today. I really appreciate your time.